a lot of lifestyle changes have come in, and it is, natural for those people to feel kind of depression and, a feeling of loneliness and so on. So that is why, it is not so good. Another problem is, if we see the community outside near us, there is a lot of suffering, a lot of problems. We start with the problem, the migrants. We have all seen the mass exodus and how, migrants are desperate to go to back to their homes. They stayed for some time, for a month or so, but after that, that desperation started because they did not have economic means for subsistence, and that is why, they had to leave. And see, we have seen, a lot of stories which are very heart wrenching, and actually we feel so sad seeing them, that, how they walk through, and they slept on the, railway tracks, and and died and so on. There's a lot of plight of the, migrants have been visible, and it has shown that how economy is very on very low level. It's not even there. The economic suffering and economic plight of merely 2 months. See how much economically sound our economy is, or how sound these people are. So, what to do about these migrants is a major question. Now, of course, we have to shift from the, the center of policy making has to shift from the cities to the villages, because village is now going to be center of policy, should be the center of policy making, because what is happening in the villages is because basically the shift is there and people are not ready to come back. Although now the factory owners and the people want that, the people should come back, those laborers should come back, because their work is at a standstill. But yet, this might not happen in the near future. So they should be given employment opportunities, and the government should focus on employment in the rural areas, which was earlier missing. So now the shift in policy making should be there. So, how much psychological trauma they underwent, and now they are undergoing also, because now when they are in their villages and they do not have means of living, what will happen? So the trauma is not only just ended, it is still continuing, and so that is why the shift has to be, it's imperative. Then we see, a lot of economic activities which have halted, and that is why we see the middle class also. Now this middle class is also psychologically very low, because they do not have that much source of earning, that they can willingly live their lifestyle, because now lifestyle, and they cannot ask also money from somebody, because their ego is also there, and so neither they can ask from anybody, nor they can actually nor they can do other things. So that is why a lot of many problems are there with the middle class as well. And so now the shift should be there on the medium and small enterprises as well. Now the rich class, if we see the rich class is feeling, because their work is at standstill, and they are not, they do not have laborers, they do not have a source of income. Again, a lot of trauma is there and a lot of problems are there. So it is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning, and we have to face a lot of economic problems later on. Now, if you see the students are so anxious that as to what to do, and what will happen of their future, because they do not know that where how the exams will take place, because it is a totally change of scenario. And even those online classes were not so easy for them, because, and not even for the faculty also, because they had to learn new things. Of course, it can be an opportunity that we have learned new things, of course, that we have seen. But yet, a lot of changes, behavioral changes, both positive and negative, has been there. And citizens have experienced a lot of pressures in the as the impact of the lockdown. So government has to draft certain recommendations for the citizens. And now the better part of the story is also that we have seen community working for the other, for the vulnerable, the needy, and so on. And how they have come forward, and they have a lot of health workers are there, NGOs, and Gurdwara management committees, also self-help groups are there, resident welfare associations, who are even police and journalists for that matter. They are working for the people, They are trying to help the people out, and they are even sort of, they are working, especially the food problem they are trying to solve, and for the homeless, migrants, refugees, and needy people. Community kitchens are there to combat the hunger. Then they are distributing cooked meals or grocery kits also, and also using the technology like the WhatsApp group, so that they ward off any chaos which is there visible all over. So in times ahead, India is still gripped with severe mental health issues and a crisis which is emerging due to economic suffering, unemployment, indebtedness, family discords, domestic violence, alcohol abuse during the pandemic. So in this time, we have seen the government also trying to connect people positively. For that matter, we have addressed the nation, motivating them, and this telecast of the Hindu mythological serials on the national TV, and also lighting diyas, and felicitation of the doctors, and launching of Arogya Setu app, and all this. This is what all the government is trying to engage to the citizens productively, so that do not people do not feel psychological issues and succumb to the ill effects of the isolation eventually. So the analysis has to be done, because the unfolding situation of the future will require to build the community, and their emphasis on the solution that are devised and substantiated by local evidences. Because we can't, the government cannot make the policy at the macro level. It has to be take into consideration the local evidences, the local experiences, and so a lot of democratization, or a lot of decentralization has to be done, so that people solve the problems at the local level, and the community becomes active there. So local issues after long and acute pandemic phase can be handled only locally, I believe, and by building community-based capacities. So communities have to be, build their capacities, and for this, a rigorous partnership between civil society and government machinery is forged. It is required, and then the unfailing quality support will come from all quarters. So the future strategy is that we have to see the potential of the community to overcome this luminous and this acute mental distress, this which is prolonging from the pandemic, because it is not ended, and it will not end very soon also, as we know, because of the economic suffering and because of other psychological issues. And so that is why we have to aim to stress or emphasize on community more, and so that is why government has to tie up with the community, or the NGOs should come forward and involve the community and solve the local problems at local levels, to make India more vibrant, and again, that what is required. So that is why with this, these words, I want to again emphasize that the topic for today is very important, because after all, we are, the solution to this problem can be only community based, and we have to see the local experiences. And I think our experts for today have done a lot of research into the ground level realities, and they know how to solve the problems, and they can all tell us certain things which are going to be really conducive and positive, and solve the problems later on. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your observations. I now request Dr. Garima Kumar to take over from here, introduce the subject and begin the discussion. Garima.
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you. At the outset, a very warm welcome to all participants once again. Supreet, Vinita, really grateful that you're here. And as we all know, ma'am has already, laid the groundwork for the importance of community work in today's times. And we do recognize that we've all come together for a very pertinent area of concern. And as one of the key aspects of higher education, engaging with community has in fact been emphasized as one of the foundational elements, or the third important pillar of higher education, teaching and research being the other two. In fact, the UNESCO statement mentions it as the third mission. So as we all recognize today that the notion that the university, is only supposed to be contributing to societal development solely through, in terms of educating and teaching its citizenry, is gradually losing its ground, losing its merit. And we are now recognizing that universities' role goes much beyond that. And, given that kind of a reality, and also the fact that there is a challenging public discourse, an increased kind of a pressure for educational accountability, we truly recognize the need to reiterate our commitments to public purposes and community involvement, as Professor Harpreet has also, alluded to in her observations, that the community involvement, be it at the individual levels or collective levels within higher education, is very, very critical, and more so during the current pandemic conditions, where there is anxiety, there is a whole lot of anxiety, and there is a whole lot of probably depression and fear as to how things move forward from here. So there's a greater sense of alienation that is happening at the moment, and probably this is a very critical time when we need to again build some kinds of mechanisms where people are able to bounce back even when they're grieving. They're able to come out of their losses, and again there is some kind of a resilience that is brought back to societies. So needless to say then, at this juncture that we find ourselves in, I think it is probably a very, very appropriate time where we recognize that real world learning experiences for students as well as academicians, including, I think, the opportunities like these to gain from, very, very informed and rich experiences of practitioners and professionals from the field who've engaged with diverse communities at the grassroots level. This is definitely, most definitely the need of the hour. And in this light, I think it is indeed a privilege basically to have amongst us two professionals with backgrounds in psychology and who are extremely, let me tell you, very, very passionate about their work they do, deeply committed to the concerns of mental health, public health within their diverse communities that they work in. Supreet, Vinita, a very warm welcome once again. And let me share on a more personal note, something that, I've not brought up till now, is that I also have the privilege and, being together with both Vinita and Supreet during my postgraduate years. And we do share a very, very personal, strong bond. And so, I thought it was appropriate that the kind of work they've done, and it also gave me the opportunity to, bring them together on this forum. And I'd, at this point in time, also really very grateful from the bottom of my heart to our principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur, who is constantly encouraging us and motivating us to, zestfully keep ourselves engaged in such meaningful conversations with experts from diverse locations. Really thankful to you, ma'am, for giving us this opportunity. And, let me just bring home the point that we are not going to be following a presentation mode. The three of us will be interacting and engaging together, and it'll be a panel discussion. So, all three of us interact together. Vinita and Supreet have both been very gracious to, to have agreed to respond to some of our concerns and queries that we might have. And I'll take on some questions which I feel would be relevant while working with communities. And how does one engage in communities if one is passionate about it? Or one is developing, wanting to develop a program. So some such concerns as a part of the discussion process. And we'll be happy, the panelists will be happy to take up questions that you may have along the way at the end of our discussion, which you can keep popping in the chat box, and we'll be happy to take them towards the end of the discussion. I'd also like to say that both our panelists today will be sharing their experiences of being with communities from their own diverse perspectives. This will also be reflective of the context that they work in and also how they've been engaged with the communities, whether it is India, New Zealand, or Australia. And they have both contributed in their own unique ways, whether by virtue of providing support at the individual level, when engaging with specific set of people who may present themselves with mental health issues or concerns while working with communities, or they may have engaged at group or collective levels. And in this process of our interaction today, then what I hope to bring up is certain aspects that we need to be mindful of when one is, as I said, developing an approach to engaging with members, within a community. Thank you once again for being here. And, if we can begin the interaction. And as I said, at the end of the discussion, our panelists would be happy to take on your questions. So Supreet, Vinita, I think the first thing that comes to my mind and to us all, it would be that, it will help us if you are able to tell us the context in which, you're working, the kind of work that you've done till this point in time. What is it that you're engaged in, and what does your work entail? I think to start the ball, to keep, to begin to initiate the conversation, I think this particular contextualization will put things in perspective. So maybe I think Vinita can probably respond to this first, and then I'd also like Supreet to come in and share how, her context is in some ways similar or probably different from the Indian context, the kind of, diverse communities that she's engaged in. But Vinita, if you could respond first, and would be happy to hear from Supreet then.
Sure. All right. Good morning, everybody. So I currently work as a mental and public health consultant, and I take on projects in the area of mental health as well as public health, not only for not-for-profit organizations and NGOs, but also for the government sector. Now, it all started with initially working in the mental health sector, because by virtue of my qualification, my degree, I started with community work in the slum areas of Delhi. I kind of associated myself with NGOs when I was in my post-graduation years, and that's when the whole story of community work started. And I mean, it was, I think, moving on to public health was a very natural offshoot, because health, public and mental, it's like physical health and mental health is so strongly linked. You cannot just, so it just came as a natural thing that while working in the area of mental health, I got into public health. And that is how it has been. Currently, I'm involved in some projects of the government in the area of public health, and also work with NGOs working with children. So I work with special children, and I also work with, have done some work recently with institutionalized children, basically. Children who are institutionalized in childcare institutions.
Okay. Okay. And, if I were to look at the vast amount of work that you've done, you've also engaged at the community level. You've said that you're currently doing a project. You've also worked on a research project with IIM Ahmedabad.
Right.
Tell us a bit more about it so that we would better understand what is the nature of work that you were doing there as well.
All right, yeah. So I joined IIM. I was fortunate enough to actually join IIM Ahmedabad just at the time when they started initiating a mental health support program, which was for the government over there. And the idea was, Gujarat has been one of the states to be one of the front runners in having a policy for mental health. So they were very sensitive about the need for mental health interventions, and they roped in an educational institute of prominence, which is IIM, to identify the priorities for the mental health sector. Which are the target groups which should be, given help, and what are the areas in mental health, because there can be so many issues with diverse groups. There can be issues like mental health of victims of domestic violence. A lot of street children have got mental health issues. Children living in slum areas, they have. Then there are psychotic patients. There are people with less severe, mental illness. So what are the different groups which need help, and how do we go about identifying interventions for them? That was the area. And in fact, this also helped the government ultimately draft their policy of mental health. So what we did there is, I'm Ahmedabad being the nodal agency responsible for implementation. The first task was capacity strengthening of NGOs in the area. A lot of NGOs, close to 100, were sensitized, about the need for mental health care and the kind of interventions. And then we kind of asked NGOs to, those who were sensitized and those who wanted to work in it. 14 of them were involved eventually in implementing pilots. And every pilot was very different from the other because everyone tried to adopt a different intervention and a different group. It was a different group that they worked with.
Because let's say to tailor, your
absolutely
your need assessment for different groups, and then it doesn't have to be a one size fits all kind of a situation.
Absolutely.
You have to tailor your programs and design your programs in a way that probably helps specific groups, catering to their needs. And so
Right.
multiple groups in the area of health, which means diverse groups, whether you're talking about mental health or physical health, or the work with street children, or as you say, what
Right.
all are, so divergent groups, and working for some kind of a policy creation, so that, and also tying up with NGOs and other civil society bodies. And here I'd
Absolutely.
also like to bring in, Supreet and has, her kind of work, and specifically looking at, what you worked on. You say that you work with diverse communities, not just Vinita's work, Vinita's forte is in the Indian setting. You work with, communities with refugee backgrounds, people coming from different nationalities. So how is it different, and how do you go about it? A little bit about your context, if you, share with us.
Sure. Thank you, Garima. And also, quickly just thank you to Dr. Professor Kaur and Dr. Manisha Mathur for inviting us and give us the opportunity to speak here. And, I just want to, I started my, career in psychology in India and migrated to New Zealand. And my work in New Zealand started as a psychologist working with people who were coming from refugee background. And so, as probably some of you might be aware that, there are certain developed countries who have a united, an agreement with the UNHCR, the High Commission of Refugees, and they take in a certain quota of refugees every year. And so that's where my work started. And, working with people coming from different nationalities, ethnicities, genders, coming from very culturally diverse backgrounds, with different kinds of visa status. So there was and then after that, I moved on to a kind of a manager position where there was a specialist service which was being developed for providing services to refugees in the community. And now this work was more, like working with people from diverse backgrounds or refugee-like backgrounds is always on the interface of clinical and community. So we kind of set up it was a pilot project where there was a multimodal team which kind of wanted to support refugee people because, as they have a very high, they've been through a lot of trauma in their life, a lot of persecution, a lot of grief. And so it was very necessary to kind of have services which was tailored to them. So that was, a large part of my work in New Zealand. And I'm sure I can, come back to it and take examples and talk more about it later. After that, I kind of moved to Australia about 7-8 years ago. And in Australia, I've been working a lot in private practice, where being from a diverse community myself, it was but natural that I'm going to get lots of clients from my own culture and also clients from the Asian subcontinent, along with the mainstream population. And so I, kind of started working with elderly people, with young people, with parents of Indian families, many Punjabi families, one of the areas where I live in, there are a lot of people from that community as well. And kind of then there was another shift where I think personally as well, I've moved into the area of monitoring and research, where it kind of, rather than a more hands-on work, I have an observer perspective and trying to see how work is being done for people who are coming from diverse communities by the mainstream organizations here, and how they are making efforts to engage with people who speak different languages, who are coming from different cultures. As you can imagine, it's a big challenge for them here as well. So, in a nutshell, I would say that that's the kind of scope of my work.
So what I understand is that a lot of divergent background cultures coming together. So of course, we'll speak about their challenges, which is of course one part of the story. But how do you, as a psychologist, because you're working with people from diverse backgrounds, are able to develop a perspective? How is it different from dealing with people from your own cultural background? It would have been a challenge for you too, right? So how does it work, and how is it different from engaging with people from your own cultural background? And the fact that you, as you mentioned, that you belong to a diverse community yourself, in what ways do you think that either facilitated or hindered your process of engagement with people coming from these diverse backgrounds?
Sure. So I'll take your question in two parts, Garima. One is of course, my work with people from refugee backgrounds and nationalities and ethnicities. Now there, because many of them were coming from the Middle East, were coming from Afghanistan, were coming from Sri Lanka, and we as coming from Indian culture, we kind of share similarities in terms of our cultural values. So I think it was kind of easy for me to work with them, to relate with them. And if those of you who've studied or lived overseas know that, you feel very connected when you meet people from your own type of cultural backgrounds. So I think there was that enthusiasm of working with them. And also, I guess the challenge there would be also, like, sometimes when you see the perceived similarities can overshadow the differences. Like, I think that can possibly sometimes be a challenge, because it's important to see that even though you're trying to connect with them at a human level, but you need to understand the nuances of their specific cultures, their cultural norms, their cultural values, which even though might be broadly like mine, but there are differences which need to be acknowledged as well. Also, I think, as we probably all know, like my master's is from University of Delhi, our disciplines are very Western oriented. Like our models of psychology, the therapeutic interventions that we are trained in, so that that kind of works with the mainstream. But when you work with people who are from diverse communities, you need to work with them in their context, or you have to adapt how you work, how you assess them by, because they have, as we all know, there's so much of stigma. They're wanting to, how they perceive us as an authority person, trying to deliver mental health services is also a challenge. So tailoring my work, tailoring these nuances, and psychologically kind of modulating my interventions, which can help them, was a challenge. And I'm happy where you need to provide examples as well.
Yeah. So here, come back to you, Supreet, on the examples and on the specifics of how you went about it. Here again, I'd like to bring in Vinita. You work with diverse groups. You were talking about it.
Right.
Why? Culturally, there would be a greater similarity when you're working with all Indians. But is it also that you too find challenges, because, as Supreet also mentioned, the kind of probably the rural communities that you work with and the kind of socioeconomic status that people come from, the connect that one is able to build. How are you perceived when you first enter into a community kind of a setting? How are you received? And how do you build, the initial level of probably the trust that may be the initiating step that is required before you, actually think of bringing about some kind of a positive change through interventions to be able to recognize their world? I think, even though, the nationality may be the same, nevertheless, our, situations, our contexts are entirely different. So how do you go about it? How do you think, breaking the ice with a community which is very, very different from the kind of backgrounds that we come from?
Definitely. Dharma, yes, like Supreet mentioned, there is definitely a major challenge. But I think, like she said, the first important thing is to be able to develop a connect with them. Because when you're going from a diverse, because we work with, like you said, people from the rural areas, it may be even in the urban areas, we may be working with the slum community. There are socio-economic differences, there are cultural differences, because India is such a diverse, country. We have so many different states, and every state has its own cultural nuances and things like that, right? So when we try, the first thing is what I have found to be very useful is usually we go with the local community people to help us. They act as a bridge. So let's say if it's a government project, usually we do receive help from some health workers, or the government facilitates our connection with the community people, community leaders, community workers. But in case of non-government and community-based organizations, usually they're working in the same area. They may be working on a different issue or on multiple issues in the same geographical area. So they do have a connection with their, again, local people. It could be the panchayat, it could be village leaders, community leaders. So it usually is very helpful to, first build a rapport with them, connect with them. It also helps you identify the demand and need of the community, and then through them, we meet with the other people. Another thing that we need to take care is that we have to try to reduce the dissimilarities, so to say. So let's say maybe when I was much younger and at the beginning of my career, I may have not realized that it is so important to dress up in a certain manner which is acceptable to the community. I can't think of wearing a very modern outfit and walking into a community which is very traditional or is embedded. So I realized that, we have to dress up like them. We have to talk to them when we go into the community, rather than trying to say, we are here to help you, because that's a normal tendency everyone has, we've come from outside and we're here to help. No, it has to be trying to understand their needs, what they want. And then very gradually, once the connection is established, then it becomes very smooth. And believe me, they are all very helpful. Once they see that you're not, you're not there for any other reason but to help them, they do become very receptive.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the importance of first networking with the community leaders, with the key linking persons. How does that solve? Who initiates you to that, and how then does that all happen? Somebody initiates you, somebody tells you, like for example, you say that in certain situations it would be probably the state who would be putting you in touch with those,
Absolutely.
linkages.
Absolutely.
I'm just a little intrigued by that particular fact. Do the communities then not become a little more resistant simply because of the fact that this is a person who's been somewhere there's some kind of a bureaucratic centralized hierarchy operating, which then a designated person by the state becomes the link, the person of contact for you? Does it become harder? Because the other things that you mentioned were about the local people through their own inbuilt systems of mechanisms. One is able to identify the person that you may be able to talk with. But if it's a state designated person, does it not bring in issues of its own?
When it comes to implementation, I don't think so, because the community health workers do help in that thing, and they want to know what you're there for. And if they see that whatever you are trying to help them with is actually something they do need or demand, then there is no problem. In times of monitoring evaluation, and at times, they're very much in awe of you. Sometimes it's very funny. You go there and they think that, you've come from somewhere, and they'll call maybe their local media person and this and that. So those kind of things do happen, which may at times hinder the monitoring evaluation. But if you do go, with their frontline health workers or with other people in the community, I don't see too much of a problem there. If you're going there for program implementation and are there to stay for a long time, no, it doesn't really hinder.
So how have your experiences been, Supreet? Are they similar when dealing with diverse communities? You said you will be sharing some examples from your work. I think there is, you're not audible, you're muted, Supreet.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I thought I had unmuted, but no, I was still muted. So,
Yeah.
I think, when the pilot project that we were working on in New Zealand, but also the work that is now being carried on in Australia with local community organizations on the issues that are affecting them. Like, say, for example, domestic violence or family violence is a very big issue in Sydney as well. Not just for the mainstream population, but also for the migrant population which is living over here, and it's very scary, believe me. But so in terms of our work as well, what I've learned with both the places is that it's very important to strike a partnership and with the community people. So, and I think like in Australia, New Zealand, the word partnership is taken quite seriously, where you want the communities to help you to co-design in the project. To start from the very go, you kind of have, people go, like say the mainstream organization, the health or mental health, they would go into the communities. They will find out who the community leaders are. They will find out which the local community organizations are. They'll strike a relationship with them. They will do focus group discussions with them. They'll ask them, we are also think there's a need. You also say there's a need. How can we work together? How can we collaborate? How can we come together to kind of, meet the needs of this particular community? And I think when I say the word need, I think it's important also to always mention that there's a lot of resources in the community as well, which we sometimes overlook. So we have to kind of partner with what is the strengths of that particular community as well, and use them in our work to kind of build the partnership. So so I think like in the work in New Zealand, we had people who we used to call them community link workers. In one organization I'm working here, they call community facilitators. So they are people from the community. So the whole work is to train them to facilitate program for people which is culturally responsive. So even if say you were to go into the rural communities, you would understand what are their particular community cultural needs and take them into consideration by having people from their own community go through courses, training in family violence, for example, and deliver those communities. So that was a large part of the way as well, where bridges are built for community engagement.
True. So the sense that I get from you is that it is really, really important in community work to be probably saying that the voice of the people from the community is somewhere not lost. It is them for whom the programs are made. It is them for whom the programs are designed. So rather than having a vantage point, which is very, very power-laden from our specific, as you mentioned, Western models of education that we bring into our learnings, I think, obviously then there are challenges of us to be self-reflective in our journeys as psychologists, as professionals from the field, to be cognizant of the fact that those are not, paradigmatic positions, too entrenched, in our paradigmatic positions. We take up a, view of a situation which is totally relevant from the point of view of the way we look at things. As the paradigm shouldn't act as blinders in that sense. And that is why community workers and linking with people from the communities is probably of help to you, where they feel a part of the whole process of change. You mentioned domestic violence, and as I get from your conversation that probably within the communities that you worked with, there was a kind of readiness about addressing issues like domestic violence. And so you probably felt that we need to together address this. Here I want to look at, Vinita's perspective about, let's say if you are working with domestic violence in the Indian culture, and I don't know if it is true, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are certain spaces within the rural communities or even slums within Delhi. I have my domestic work helper who comes and says that, my husband is like that, beats me off and on, but at least I have a shelter. And it's just that when he is not in the right state or he's drunk, would he get into these kind of behaviors which are rather aberrant. But otherwise, that's what, sare mard aisa hi karte hain. So if you try to make some kind of a difference in the lives of people like this, where you feel that domestic violence is a challenge, is a problem that you need to address, but the lady in question has struck her own balance in life, how do you think then, things like this work, and how do you kind of make a positive change? Probably, there is no readiness as of now. We take it as a normalized part of our daily living. We take it as a given. So how does it work in such situations?
Yeah, Garima. So definitely, I think domestic violence is a big taboo thing to be discussed in the Indian society, and I don't know, maybe even abroad. And it actually cuts across the various social economic groups. I don't think it is something which is very relevant only. The problem is not only there, but yeah. But we have worked with a community where we try to work on domestic violence, and we did find that going and talking to ladies about this did not help, because the ladies would never come out with a problem. I remember a case, I had worked with a lady and I had seen her with some injury on her head, and I asked her what happened. And she said, "Main to seedhi se gir gayi thi." So she did not tell. And then, of course, later on, the community people told me that, madam, this is what had happened, and her husband beat her up. What we realized is that, maybe ladies are not ready to one-on-one talk with this. If you go to a community and say we're working on domestic violence, you can't start it that way. So we go there, we go as saying we're going in for general counseling services. We talk about different issues. And many times what I have seen to be working is, you can't even go and see or confront a lady and say, hey, I came to know that, you've been beaten by your husband and I should take him to the police. So we can't get into advocacy. We can't get into other things which may actually be more detrimental to the lady, because she is not financially this thing. She wants to live with her family. It's just a trait that a husband has at times, and otherwise she's okay with it. So I think normal counseling services, we have seen that in such cases, in a slum that I worked in, group counseling really helped, where we would call a group of 10 to 12 ladies and say, okay, today we'll talk about different issues. And in the thing, they automatically come out with certain concerns at times. That makes them more receptive also to take help, rather than going and confronting them and saying, I'm aware of this problem. Second thing is, I think it is very important to to work on issues like this. We have to take a more long-term perspective. How do we equip women with those kind of skills or other things which would anyway enable her to be a little more busy, or have a different life in terms of working and being feeling more useful and other things, rather than just accepting things like that. So, and many times in counseling, you'll be surprised, men also come, once at times they may be curious about why do you want to talk to my wife, or what do you want to talk to her about? But once we build the, rapport with the community and start some rehabilitation work or some skill training work and all, even they come out with their problems, and then things become a little more easy to handle.
Yeah, so men, at the end of the day, men also become receptive, is what your perception is?
Yes, some of them do, some of them do not, but yes, they do.
Okay, and so how do you ensure that this realization, this newfound realization, actually brings about some positive change in the long run? Because this is this is a concern that probably while the intervention is going on, probably you see certain positive results, and
yes.
Beyond that, how does it work? That is one part of it, and So how do you ensure that probably there is some kind of a sustainability of the project, even when you're not there? So how does it work? And is it always really possible to disengage? Because at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility for your own actions, is what your strengthening is for. So when you're ready to leave with your program, is it always that you see those kind of positive results, or disengagement could also be a challenge? And I'd both like both you and Supreet to respond in terms of this.
Right. I think this is a very, very important question, Garima, because eventually we have to understand that we enter, for any intervention, it cannot be going on forever, right? Most of the projects are very dependent on donor funding or other funding, and they go on for 2, 3, 5 years. There'll be very few community organizations who are there to stay, and the work goes on. Supreet said, partnerships is the first and foremost thing, I think, which goes all the way to ensure sustainability. From the time, we enter, the community acts like a bridge. It helps us enter, right? The community people are instrumental in connecting us with the rest of the community. And then there are a lot of them inside who, we try to rope in as volunteers, as, sometimes we form some, maybe community, a committee. Let's say it could be a village health committee, or it could be a mental health committee that we form within the community setup. Sometimes we train lay counselors. Awareness training, is something, awareness generation starts from the beginning. So the awareness generation exercises that we do are usually in the form of something that the community can relate to. It could be in the form of a street play. It could be in the form of some dance or cultural program that they are very fond of, and they, can associate with. And through that, we tell stories. Like, there could be a family story revolving around domestic violence in that. So that is how the demand for it is generated. And thereafter, we usually have a community set up, maybe someone or some people we train as maybe lay counselors who can be there because they're living in the community. So even after we go, or the pilot ceases to exist, or the intervention or program also ceases to exist, they are there in the community. We handhold them for a certain time so that they can take on the basic counseling and do certain things, and we also equip them to refer, because the constraint is always there. They're not professionally trained, so they cannot assume that they can handle the whole case as it is. So they should be able to identify that this person needs help and then refer them to the concerned people. So this is usually something that we adopt. Yeah.
Thank you, Vinita. Supreet, how about you? Is it the same for you, the sustainability of a project, and that it carries on much later? Also, the fact that you have to integrate the families within the larger community. It's a different nation. Does it become harder? How does it happen? Eventually, and in fact, during the course of our discussions, I remember that before the session, you mentioned that it's very important to not use the word refugee, and to say that, these are people from refugee backgrounds, because now they are no longer refugees. To come to that state, right? The fact that they have that sense of belonging within the community, which is, they are not native inhabitants of that community, and yet there is that sense of belonging. What goes into that? The preliminaries of how you work towards that particular end. Building that trust and ensuring that they are in a position where they are able to come to this point. So, Preet, you're muted. You're muted.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, audible.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say, just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. One, that the readiness of communities here related to family violence is not there as much as well. So even in the Western world, especially with the migrant communities, because the pattern of relationships remains the same, the patriarchal structure of the society remains the same within the household, even though you are in a developed country. And on top of that, the women are more isolated because they are cut off from their networks at home. So it's somewhere the challenges kind of increase more here as well. Yeah, so that's one thing I wanted to kind of say as well. And so for that, it's very also important that when you're working with the communities, like say for example, different communities are at different stages of readiness. So you have to work out where is that particular community at, as well. So some communities have got a lot of educated people, they've got people who've been trained as counselors, but they may be identity as an ethnicity. It's going to take a very long time for them, or if the trauma is a lot in their host country that they've come from, or the trauma is still, they are not ready to engage, because that same thing gets transferred onto the authority here. Even though you see them as helpers, you know they are there to help you, but there's still a lot of fears, which I guess would be similar in India as well. You know, when people come from outside, what's their intention? Yeah.
So they
So
probably see an intrusion into the world that they are already used to.
so community people can become gatekeepers to their community as well. So in those situations, like Vinita and we've talked before, like if there was, again, safety and trust, starting roundabout ways, like say one idea that, a project that I'm working with, they came up with was that let's go and have meetings with the police and the community over here. Let them interact with them at a very informal level, so they understand that the role of the police is not here to break up your families, because in our cultures that's most important. पति मारता है कोई बात नहीं, लेकिन घर को नहीं टूटना चाहिए. Shame is very important. Other people should not get to know that he hits me, or verbal and emotional abuse is not considered as abuse in our community. So this, like I was telling Garima and Vinita, this is a whole separate topic for a webinar, family violence. So, but in terms of sustainability, I think, again, like Vinita said, like say, for example, in our work with refugees and people back from refugee background in New Zealand, like we started training people, and by the end of the whole thing, we had people who had completed all their accreditations and were counselors. So that also of working in a New Zealand, with all their accreditations. So how that creates sustainability, because they are going to carry the work forward. But also, I guess, like resources are less everywhere in the world. There are always people who are competing for the same amount of government money. So, it's very important to have that sustainability. But so far, I've also seen that if the work is done well, if there's evaluation and monitoring which is inbuilt in the project, which is working with the communities, where you can show to the government. Here also, you have to show to the government that what have you done? What have you achieved? How are the communities benefiting? Then it assures that the pilots become not pilots, but programs which are being run. And I've seen that happen as well here.
Yeah. So talking about you've also spoken about pilots, you've spoken about sustainability. That brings me to another important point. Vinita, you work with a lot of pilot studies in the IMA context. I also wanted to know that, for example, if you're working on a pilot project and you realize that it's not working, and somehow it's not getting you the right kind of response that you're looking for in the first place, then how do you go about it? It means changing or revisiting the very objectives that you first began with. The whole notion or the whole program that you first, the ideology that you built the project around has to be revisited. Then how do you negotiate such kind of challenges? Especially, in the context of the fact that you already got funding for certain pilot projects. So how do you negotiate those kind of challenges? Have you ever realized that you worked on a particular project, it's not been working, and then you kind of revisit the entire thing? And in terms of ground reality, how does it pan out?
Yeah, sure, Garima. So basically, like we said, the basic purpose of a pilot is it's exploratory to see what works in the field and what doesn't work in the field. So the very idea of taking up a pilot, which may be, time specific and all, is to determine the feasibility of the intervention, how realistic is the intervention, is there actually a demand or need for the service in the community that we are trying to initiate over there. And is the pilot feasible in the long run? Is it cost effective? There are so many things which go into, deciding whether the project or the pilot has to be upscaled. Is it sustainable or not? Now, there can be, it's quite possible, like in that huge project that we took up, it's possible that if the government decides to undertake 10 pilots, for example, 3 or 4 may be very, very, found to be very, very sustainable, very, very meaningful, and something that is really important to be upscaled. But there might be some projects which we realize in the field that no, even after trying, every project does go through some midterm reviews. It goes through evolution in the field. We always adapt and try to this thing, but it is still possible that some pilot may show that the results are not what we're looking for. In such cases, we might just have to close it as a 2 or 3 year project, and then it doesn't take off, right? The pilot just doesn't take off. But there might be some pilots which we find are very relevant and required, and so they have to be. Some have to be dropped, some have to be upscaled and taken further.
Is it taken well on a more little personal note? Is it taken well if you say that this pilot is not working, it has to be taken off in the context of funding and in the context of bureaucracy? And, how does that happen?
See, pilots may be taken well because after all, the idea of the pilot was to see the feasibility. But in terms of programs or projects which are initiated by some, large funding agencies, usually see what happens is obviously everyone who's funding or anyone who is working in it wants or has this thing that this is the hypothesis, and going into the field, this is the results that we should have. So when the results are not in that direction, it does become disappointing. And I think it becomes one of the major dilemmas for us also that, we thought we were going to bring about this thing, but this didn't happen. So at times you have to convey that this is something which is not working. At times it may be taken well, at times it may not be taken well. But this does happen.
Instances that have happened, and how did you go about it?
We ultimately write our reports and we do share whatever is the ground reality, right? So anything that would be received well, ultimately it is on the donor agency whether they want to take it on or not. But then, we do try to tell them what it is.
All right. I think in your previous comments, I think both of you, Supreet, you also mentioned the role of evaluation of how well the program is doing, and whether that needs to carry on. Is it meeting the needs of the community that it was envisaged for? And you also said that evaluation is important, Vinita. So Supreet, how does evaluation how is evaluation initiated in the Australian and New Zealand context?
So, I'm speaking from whatever my experiences around monitoring and evaluation projects. So I cannot speak generally, but I think what we say. Yeah. So I think, with monitoring and evaluation, like say, for example, the refugee service that I was working with. So we had external monitoring and evaluators who came in from outside. And they were, having a mixed methods approach, both qualitative and quantitative, and they interviewed the participants we worked with. They interviewed the organizations we were dealing with, that are we building their capacity or not, which was one of the objectives, for example, of the, just again seeing, they had discussions, in-house discussions with us as a team. What are our challenges? What do we need to do differently? Or what are we doing well? How can we build on that success? So I think that was, a very fruitful kind of exercise for the whole team, and also for the funders to give us more resources where we needed it, or to show them the kind of work that we were doing. On the other hand, I just want to mention, evaluation tools have to be very tailored to the community that you're working with as well. So for example, at the moment, there's a tool called the Most Significant Change Technique, and which is designed by Rick and Davis, which is designed for working with communities or social development projects. So they're done in a very simple ways, where you ask people, what is it that has changed because of this project? So you want to see the effect of the project on the participants' lives, because that's what you're wanting to see. that this project has made a difference. So in a very simple narrative kind of style, which people can understand because everybody understands stories. So that was one technique I thought I would mention here, which I think works well with communities. But also I think, like what assessment tools that you use, they have to be translated properly. And it's not just a literal translation, but a meaningful translation so that they understand. Vinita mentioned earlier that there are hierarchy issues. So for example, we were told don't send community link people from the community to do the evaluation. Otherwise, they're going to say your project was awesome. Because they
Absolutely.
can't say otherwise. They are obliged. There is respect. There's hierarchy. So you have to have independent people doing it. Have it in a simple form. So I think monitoring and evaluation specifically tailored to the community that you want to work with, and kind of inbuilt with the work. Like, here, even before starting a project, you have a program logic where you see what are the outcomes going to be, what are the long-term outcomes, what are the short-term outcomes. You go backwards, the whole design is made first, and then you kind of start working on those outcomes and see how far the project is successful, or the process, because it doesn't have to be successful. There can be challenges as well, like COVID is a challenge in current times. Many projects, research projects or community projects, have come to a halt because of this, or have to be done differently. Yeah.
All right. So it's about having a robust mechanism for evaluating, as I understand, whether it is in terms of technique or the program logic model that you spoke of, moving back and forth, making sure at all times that the community voices are heard, making sure that it's workable for them rather than taking a hierarchical position. Is it similar in our own context, Anita?
Yes, Garima. Actually, in fact, I was wanting to speak and say that the kind of thing that she has mentioned in our government projects and the large funding agency projects, we follow a very, very similar trend. We have an inbuilt evaluation and monitoring mechanism. We do rope in people from outside as external evaluators. This is a very important part. This is done absolutely. When you're working with the smaller NGOs, it may not be that stringent, but then you do have the donors in any case wanting to come and find out what's happening in the field. So yeah, we do organize, usually what we do is we organize focus group discussions or, key informant interviews, KIIs as we call them, in the field with, the people who are involved in helping out in the field. We do KIIs with them, and the beneficiary groups, we usually do sometimes a one-to-one discussion, or sometimes it is a focus group discussion which is done to identify whether the benefits are actually reaching the people that we say it is. Yeah, it is quite similar.
It is similar?
Yes.
And in fact, during our informal conversations a little while ago, you had mentioned that when you go for evaluation, probably the kind of thing that you see is कि अच्छा ये सरकार से लोग आए हैं, and there's a whole publicity stunt around it. And do you think that colors or that brings in some kind of biases or some kind of problems in the kind of results that are shared with you? Would it be a position that is a socially desirable position that is taken? And because of the fact that we are aware of these kind of contexts, what practical steps would you take to be able to ensure that this whole process is rather an unbiased exercise so that it ultimately works for the community?
Okay, so I would like to share the same example of the case where I said that, when we went and there was this photograph session and everything, we were doing an evaluation of a program in a school. In some very remote villages of some states of the country. We had to go to different states, and so while the people who were involved, the government, I won't say the government, but let's say the school teachers and the principal or the health workers, they saw you as someone who's coming from outside they have to, so the kind of things they do are very small, and sometimes they actually touch you also. They'll clean up the whole the school campus, and on the board which they have outside the building, it's a small building, they have something saying so and so has come, and they just write. So there's simple ways in which they make you feel very important. But when you go ahead to do the FGDs with the beneficiary group, which in our case was school students, they are not affected too much by all these things. So they, initially they will be shy, but then we do have interpreters who speak the same language, and again the community people who are there. Maybe not the same community people, because it depends on the sensitivity of the topic. So we do have our own team of people who speak the same language, are able to relate to them, but the confidentiality, the informed consent, all these things are very, very important when we do these things. So all of these things being taken into account, the actual direct beneficiary group, they don't see you, or they don't give you wrong answers based on your so-called image which is created. KIs at times may be influenced, because when you do the key informant interviews with the service providers in the community level, they may try to show that yes, we're doing good work, but we come to know the truth when we kind of try to triangulate the results of the KIs, of the FGD. So it emerges. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of evaluation, let's say at the evaluation stage, you feel that something is not working, and the whole project, is dependent upon funding and stuff. And if you're going completely, and if you, it's like if you think about it, and if you see that it is not working at all, and there's a huge amount of funding, are there kind of dilemmas? How do you go about sharing that piece of information, which will probably, at the end of the day, at the end of the entire journey, probably make you say that this whole project has not worked? So, any dilemmas of those kinds that you would have faced? And,
see, in cases like this, what happens is, like Supreet said, that many times, I'm sorry, I lost your question once again. The dilemmas in?
The dilemmas in terms of, at the end of the journey, when you evaluated, you found that this is the project which is just not working for the community.
Yeah, got it, right. So
those kind of dilemmas.
So see, the project is always evolving. You can't, like she said, it's a process. That's what I was saying. She said it's a process. So you can't say, sometimes one intervention may not work, doesn't mean we just give up and say, well, is there a way of kind of evolving, changing, modifying? You have to be very divergent in your thinking. You can't say theory says this and therefore only this works. Sometimes you may have to adapt and try a different intervention. Sometimes that may work. But even if we find that, the demand for that thing cannot be created, or the need is just not there, those pilots definitely we will not work, because ultimately the effectiveness of the intervention is most important. So if you're not able to rule it out.
Do you also evaluate pilot projects?
Pilot projects are evaluated, usually by external agencies, they are evaluated.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So anything that you'd like to add here, Supreet, regarding evaluation?
Not really. I think Vinita has covered it, and we've touched upon it as well. Yeah.
So on a closing note, I would want the two of you, each one in turn, to be probably sharing some of your success stories. It's an arduous journey. It's a difficult engagement, but it's a very rewarding engagement. So something
definitely.
that you'd like to share.
Okay.
Vinita,
Supreet.
whatever, either.
Vinita, you go first.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of successful, there are quite a few successful and a lot of very gratifying, satisfying experiences. I think, my experience with all the kind of projects I've taken up in the field have made me realize that the first thing that is important for the success of any intervention is the demand for that service in the community. For instance, I'll give you some instances. Let's say the community wants health services, right? They want health checkups, but that particular community is not able to afford health checkups. If we organize a health camp, it really works very well in the community. If we are able to tie up, public-private partnerships are extremely important in community, let me tell you that. I think we didn't touch upon that, but usually if you're able to rope in some, agencies which are able to provide some services. We have found that camp approach works very well for imparting healthcare services. In one particular project, we even distributed, we did an assessment and worked on disability certificates for people who were suffering from disability, and that was really appreciated by the society, the community. So these kind of programs, they know that they gain something out of it. The gains are very tangible, and they're very happy with it. Sometimes gains are not so tangible, like we discussed. Domestic violence can be a challenge because it doesn't happen immediately. So these are the kind of projects. What I find, and we were talking about COVID times and how we can help people. I realized that government-run helplines and even helplines run by many NGOs nowadays. Helplines work very well. I'll tell you the reason: because people have anonymity. When they have a problem, they share. They get counseling or whatever they want. They're not so. Helplines can work a lot as interventions for the community, for the larger community. So, and rehabilitation projects work very well, because eventually it all boils down to Maslow's hierarchy theory of needs. Even in COVID times, if you see, the mental health takes a backseat at a time when I'm not having food to eat, or when I'm suffering because of some domestic violence. Domestic violence is happening globally now because of COVID has actually increased the figures for domestic violence. So at that point of time, so many other concerns overtake. Right. So if we can have, I think even Dr. Kaur, ma'am, principal in the beginning had said that we need to see how we can help in the long run, and models will need to change. I think rehabilitation, job generation models, these things would work very well. Skill development, these are the kind of things in the rural areas would work very, very well as community projects. Yes.
Okay. Supreet, your
Sure. So I'm switched on. Yes. So what I wanted to say was that in terms of successes at an individual practitioner as well, working with different communities, when you see the person you're working with doing well, even though it's as simple as that, even though they don't understand that I've done a particular CBT technique, but I've been able to relate with them or engage with them, and they have kind of, by changing how you work with them, you're able to make a difference. I think personally for me, that is very satisfying to see them make those changes. At a more broader level, if I talk in terms of pilot projects, in terms of organizational work, for us it was a success that we were meeting the needs of the community, like with the refugee background. We had people from the community working with us, which was seen as a big asset that we had, which the other mainstream organizations did not have. And also we built our own capacities, because the communities have things to give to us as well, and I think we need to learn from them as well in terms of how we shape things and do things. And so building capacity, I see that as a success as well. I know that this is the final kind of thing, but I just want to say something around I am outside, but I'm also very connected. We have family, friends who are in India, and we are very disturbed by what's happening with the COVID situation, the situation of the Mazdoors, the exodus. It reminds you and the trauma and the grief that they all are experiencing. And one thing, when we were doing trauma work, we were told that if you've had a trauma, but after the trauma, if there are people who can connect with you, who show that they understand and empathize and relate to what and help you to recover from that at what a small level, even if it is some of your people who've come from the villages back, and you communicate with them and listen to them, that is something small. Or how university students can contribute to that, just working, I think supporting the community. I think there's going to be a lot of work around mental health after COVID, which will need to be done, because that's when, we are finding in Australia that now, because the fear around COVID has gone down, our cases have gone down, all of a sudden, now there are more cases which are coming to us. But there weren't that many when we were actually, going through the uncertainty, because the fear paralyzes you as well. It's so understanding trauma, understanding biology, social connectivity, that all of that is very important to support the people you're working and engaging them in your work.
I'm
So
sure
that
it must have been a very, very gratifying experience for you. One last question that comes to my mind is that, I'm sure sharing, listening to your experiences and getting to be enriched by your experiences, our participants, whether as academicians or students, we would want to know if as educational institutes, we would want to contribute to communities. Of course, all of us do in our own small ways. There is the NCC wing of the college, and there is the NSS, and there is some bit of work that is definitely tangible, which is very, very gratifying. But if we were to institutionalize the whole process of community building work and engaging with communities, which is possibly the way forward, given the fact that the new curriculum framework requires that universities and colleges contribute to community engagements in a big way. They're even thinking of making it a compulsory 2-credit course, irrespective of the stream that you come from, whether you're from a humanities background or you're from a social science background or management or the science backgrounds. Given that kind of a thing, what are the possibilities you think that we as educational institutions can take on from here in terms of community building work, and what is the way forward? And how do we ensure in this process that it is not something of we giving to the communities and looking at things from our privileged sort of point of views, but also it being a reciprocal kind of a symbiotic exercise whereby there is a meaningful gain and partnering and partnership that is built up over time. If Vinita, probably you could talk about this.
Okay, definitely. I think, like you said, that the university is now deciding to give credits to community work. I think that's a very, very good move because, see, during our times when we were studying, we didn't have any mandatory requirement to associate with an NGO or do something, right? It was a matter of choice. I decided to do it, and I think that really shaped my entire life because it kind of helped me realize my calling, which, yeah. So as students, sometimes,
choice, but we are cocooned in our own academic spaces, but we would definitely want to know how do we kind of venture out. It's very, very important for us and the students, and they're doing a lot of work in terms of internships, in terms of engaging with different civil society groups at an individual level. But how do you institutionalize the process? It still remains an ancillary concept rather than it being an integral part of so we as a society and as a nation, probably we are making a small steps towards that, but it's still, I think, not that integrated as probably Supreeti would say that it's probably the situation in Australia or New Zealand, where some specific steps have been taken to do that. So our students would be interested. What are those beginning steps that they can take? Yes.
So, see, one thing that can be done is, like we said, if a partnership can be formed between, let's say, a particular college or a university with certain NGOs, depending on the area of work. There are NGOs working in the area of environment. There are NGOs working on rights, child rights, or women's rights, or so. Depending on the area and depending on the choice of subjects of the children and their area of interest, if there can be a partnership. Such that the university tells NGOs do a lot of good work in the field, but their skills of documentation and analysis are not as good, because they are more practice oriented rather than into all these things. They would definitely do well with some help, and I'm sure they want people who can come and do research. I know organizations who are so interested in identifying students who can come and do research for them and bring out certain papers and stuff. So by doing that, the students get a chance to work on these projects and learn from the field. The organization also, they can be joint papers, right? They can be joint publications. It'll be a win-win situation for both sides actually, because that way students get a chance to learn directly from the field. NGOs also get the help that they need, and the university also has collaborations with or partnerships with these organizations. So this is one way that I see things can happen. And for students, I think working in the community really humbles you. It teaches you so many life skills. It teaches you so many simplicities of life. Believe me, a lot of, working with villagers, they are so happy and simply, they're just happy in their own life at times. They don't have the kind of tensions that a typical city dweller would have. So I'm sure the city dwellers can also learn a lot from them. They're happy, they laugh about small things. So it would be a good learning, I think, for both sides actually. And through research and papers, advocacy, policy, ultimately you're feeding into policy, right? When you publish papers, when you bring them out, that's what happens.
I think it's been a really, really enriching kind of a session that we've had with you. I'm sure our participants, all of us, have really gained from your insights because you speak of stories straight from the field. We may be, as academicians, not that involved in community work, not that familiar with ground realities. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Thank you for sharing how we can move forward, the small steps that we can take in terms of creating a difference in the lives of societies and also our own lives by becoming more enriched citizens in the whole process. I think it's a whole journey, and what I feel is that the key takeaways that I see from our discussion today is in terms of the first thing is that probably when one is engaging with communities, drop the kind of idea that you speak from a privileged position, drop the kind of idea that you are coming from a background which is much more, ready to bring about that change, because there is so much to learn from the communities themselves. If you take that kind of a high ground, moralistic kind of a position, appear like probably Messiahs, I think that is the biggest folly that one can, the biggest blunder that one can do, right? Because if one has to go with the idea that eventually the idea is to build a society which is resilient, we do need to look at their strengths, build on those existing strengths, and then from there on bring about that kind of a societal change that probably takes you in a more positive direction. But in the whole process, I think it's also a very, very humbling exercise where we do realize, as people from academia, as people who are practicing, that when we tread into the communities, we need to be cognizant about the fact that we have our own value positions, our own biases, our own preconceived notions that we need to be aware of. And the fact that you are entering into a community which is very, very different from yours, I think maintain a posture of receptivity, which is maintaining that posture is very, very important, because there's a lot that you still don't know about that community, which needs to be known rather than imposing our own standards onto that. And in this whole process, it may not be really possible to create a utopian society which is all perfect. Of course, we're gearing towards that. That is the end of the journey. The endeavor is that. But we do recognize that we may not be able to do that. We may not be probably able to reach that position of, let's say, complete justice in that role sense, right? The roles model of complete justice, where there is equality and everybody is absolutely happy and it's a perfect society. But what I think is that, look for some kind of partial justices in terms of a capability building approach that both of you have highlighted, where we can sort of salvage some kind of hope in the communities who are in themselves having their own strengths. So it's a whole process of, yes, helping them move in a direction which is more positive, and at the same time also helping them recognize that the strengths that are latent within them to emerge and then to move on from there. And in this whole process, be enriched by their knowledge systems, the native knowledge systems that we may have, and let it be a mutually gainful exercise. I think it's truly been an enriching experience. And before we close off, I'd want the participants to share any of the questions that they might have. Give me a moment. I was so engaged in the conversations that I was having with you that I kind of lost track of the questions in the chat box. So a moment, and then probably I'll Yeah. This is all. Yeah, there's this observation from Dr. Vandana, who said that we have witnessed mass movement of workers, but everyone felt that they were and are running towards their towns and villages to save their lives. Although they were getting food, but they felt the threat of the pandemic. The families and friends motivated them to come back home. They preferred to walk, but unfortunately, people couldn't understand their zeal to go back and the motive behind it. Some eagerness is seen in people same eagerness is seen in people working abroad. They are eager to come back home. So your comments on that. What could be the possible psychological journeys that they are going through as, they want to return to their native towns, specifically in the wake of the pandemic. What could be, I think what she means to, it's just an observation, but what could be the possible psychological, traumas or the concerns that they may be going through because they come to this kind of a position? If you could reflect that this is not a question directed to anyone, it's an observation. So probably, Supreet, if you can, share what you think about it.
Yeah, so Dr. Vandana, thank you for your question. And yeah, obviously we keep in touch with what's happening in India, but I think I would like, just from my somewhat further perspective compared to all of you, I would just say that, it's kind of the anxiety, and I think the economic issues of, at least if we're not getting work here, we're not having food here, let's go back home. What are we doing here? So, and I think so it's, like we can do what we want. We have to travel that journey to get back to, because there's safety over there. And I think also the whole experience of trauma, maybe some of them were not getting support from their employers, and this whole threat and anxiety around and uncertainty, which I think not just them, but the whole community is experiencing at the moment during this pandemic. What's going to happen? When are things going to stabilize? Are we going to get help? So I think all of these are issues, and I think all of us, in whatever way we can, in small or whichever, can try and kind of contribute to support with that.
True. I think it is here that our role as practitioners and psychologists who are within this particular context, we need to come forward, we need to engage. Even in this time of social distancing, probably what we need to do is that we need to be somewhere connected at the emotional levels, and to be able to relate to some of these, challenges that people are facing, and in whatever way possible, contribute in our own little ways. There is a question from Ankit Dalal, who says, and Vinita, maybe you could take that on. Students are also very confused. Some are mentally stressed, like what will be there in the future? What should they do in this lockdown? Like some are attending webinars, some doing courses, some applying for internships, all are so confused. Like what would you prefer them to do at this point in time?
Okay. So Ankit, yeah, I understand your concern as a student. Definitely, everything seems to be dangling right now. The time doesn't seem to be moving. But I think the only thing you can do right now is don't worry so much about the future, because right now that is not in your hand. What you can do is use the now, the current time that you have now, to educate yourself in areas of your interest. Try to, like, of course, now thanks to Google and other things, you can make the best use of webinars like we're doing now to, gain or enhance your knowledge in the areas that you want to. You can explore about the options that you want to take up in the future. You can also start connecting with, the learning goes on, right? So that is something that you can continue now. And I'm sure that you're not the only one right now. All the students are facing a similar dilemma, right? So I'm sure it's just a matter of time before which things take off. Right now everyone is confused and grappling with the issues, but it's not going to be forever. So make best use of the time that you have right now to build and enhance your learning. And yeah, that's how it is.
Okay. Another question is there, don't know the name because it says social science tutorials, but the observation is that when it comes to work in a community, as you say, the direct physical contact in the field is a most reliable way to build rapport and trust. In the current times where technology is the only medium to have that connect, how do you see the situation? What are the alternatives? Maybe Supreet, you can go in for that.
Yeah, it is a challenging one, but I'll just share my experience of one organization that I know with who are running a family violence project. So, like, I think somebody also commented in the chat, what do you do when projects come to a halt? And so I think they had to kind of change their way of operating. So from running groups in the community, which required physical contact and which was not possible during the COVID situation, they moved to a casework model. So where they started contacting them over phone. So it's not the most ideal way because, with families of violence, there's always risk involved. But still, to continue with their care, they started using mobile, just phone connection, and doing their work through that, make regular times when you can call them, check in with them, how they're doing, training their people again, but it's not to do that work as well, because casework has its own kind of like skills. So I'm using this time to maybe plan for further work as well, which is, so I think there are different ways. You'll have to be creative, or like Vinita said, divergent ways, think outside the square of how you can reach out or communicate. Or I think I also, how Dr. Kaur said that even at like the government needs to think of how resources now need to be put into the communities, because that's where the resources are required. So I think like how academic institutions can come together with NGOs, all of them forming partnerships and supporting the government, because they have a lot to handle as well, I'm sure. But it have to be a combined work, not one, it's
Yeah, so it has to be a kind of a complete partnership between all civil society groups. I think probably, NGOs, academicians, students, all together, sharing our own vantage points, sharing our own strengths together. And I think definitely, I think the question does get appropriately answered. Another question that comes from a lady, she says, again, the name is not very clearly mentioned. It says food technology. So developing a connect becomes very important even in our field. I think she seems to be from the food technology field. When we do diet counseling, emotionally stressed candidates tend to modify or conceal food-related information. Can the resource person suggest some tips, especially with relevance to the current COVID-19 situation, as to how to create a more effective bond? I think what she means to say is that when we do diet counseling, developing a connect becomes very important even in the field when we do diet counseling. So any of the clients coming to her for diet counseling, that kind of an emotional connect becomes very, very important even there. So these stress candidates tend to modify or conceal what they've probably eaten, the food-related information. Can the resource person suggest some tips, especially in relation to the COVID-19 situation, of how to deal with it?
Yeah.
Supreet,
okay. So I think, I think again, you have to assess where they are at, what level they are of wanting to change, right? So for example, there is a pre-contemplative state where maybe they want to change, but like some people, they don't want to change. That's one. There's some people who want to change, but they're not sure. They're pre-contemplating. Then there's completion, and then they are like, okay, yes. So I think doing motivational interviewing, asking them what is preventing them, and I think also normalizing it, I think is very important, that we all are going through this. We all are, we are dealing with stress and anxiety in our own ways, and it's okay. So I think the bars that you set for them, maybe they need to be modified during COVID times, so that they understand that you understand what's happening, And then if you help, then they can slowly work with you at whatever level they are at. If your level is at a certain level, then it's hard for them to, then they'll conceal for you. But if they know that this person will accept me and work with me from there, it'll be easier for them to establish that trust and open up to you.
Vinita, I think you can take the next question. It says, what are some of the challenges that women face during the pandemic, in your opinion, in a community kind of a situation?
Okay, so I think the kind of challenges ladies would be facing now, is the entire ladies anyway taken to be responsible for all the housework and for all all the activities that go on in the house. Currently, the whole family is sitting at home. The work for the lady definitely goes up. Okay, the children are sitting there, the husband is sitting there, she's not used to that, so that can be stressful at times, because it adds on to her work. That is one kind of stress that can happen. Of course, like we had discussed earlier, that cases of domestic violence in some cases have also increased, because when the interactions are too many, like they say, familiarity breeds contempt. At times, those kind of issues happen in houses also. So I think these are some kind of things that, these are the kind of issues which women would be going through right now. Yeah.
Right. One question from our own faculty member, Ms. Ishneen Kaur. She asks, at the time when there is so much of going around us, what tips would you like to give our students so that they can concentrate towards their goals? Yeah, that's a question from one of our faculty members. So much overstimulation, and there's so much of unrest in society at the moment because of COVID times, or probably otherwise. Too much of overstimulation for students. How do you suggest, what tips would you suggest so that they can study and concentrate on their goals? Any of you could take that question. Vinita, Supreet, anyone?
I think the pressure, like let me say, the message that my kids are in primary school, but the message that are coming from their schools is, or for the parents and the children, don't take that much of pressure at the moment. Realize that these are times are changing. But I guess that's the more Western way as well, that first focus on health, look after mental health of children and young people, and like academic thing will come. But in our cultures, reaching goals, completing targets, finishing coursework is highly kind of like important. But in some ways, like I have some people who are from the university community, but they're adapting well to the online system as well. They get more time to study and focus as well, and do other things as well. So I think with COVID there are challenges, but there are opportunities as well. But also being kind, I think that's compassionate, or they call it compassionate work, or where kindness to yourself, that look, if you have to be patient, things will get better. And keep small goals for yourself, like I said, even for diet, for studies. We some, like in our clinical work, we use step ladder work, so put small steps, then that doesn't make the whole task seem too big. Yeah, and that will improve concentration as well.
Thank you, Supreet. And I'm sure you had a look at the chat box as well. There's full of compliments for the speakers. I think they've all found this session very, very invigorating, very, very enriching. Before we close off, I now request Dr. Harinder Sandhu to kindly give the vote of thanks to the
I am so overwhelmed.
Sorry.
Garima, I'm so overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the presentation of both the speakers. For me, it has been a textbook.
You're not audible, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Vinita and Supreet. No? Still not audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's better now, I guess.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Harpreet ma'am, do you want to say something?
Okay.
You muted.
Can you hear me now?
Harpreet ma'am, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you,
Now?
but I think Dr. Harpreet wants to say something. She's muted. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Harinder.
Okay, so for me, it has been I'm so overwhelmed because for me, both Supreet and Vinita, let me share with you that for me, it has been a textbook come alive. As I shared with you, I teach community psychology, and for me, it has been a absolutely revealing session. And as we talk, let me share with you the absolutely overwhelming change that has taken place in the Western world today. The city of Minnesota has decided to disband the police department. All of us know about what's happening in the United States, and this particular set of protests actually started in Minnesota. So the city of Minnesota has decided to do away with police service, and they are going to replace it with a new system of public safety. They say they will build an alternative model of community-led safety. Now, in the history of community-led initiatives, both Supreet and Vinita will bear that this will be an absolutely watershed event. This brings, the reason I needed to mention this was because this brings us to a point where we understand that the entire world is waking up to the fact that communities have the capacities to lead themselves. And the communities are now, when such a big event has taken place, communities are waking up to challenge of taking the reins. And this is what both Supreet and Vinita had mentioned. And I am so overwhelmed and so proud of two fellow disciplinarians who have gone into an area where very few people go, because the challenges of dealing with communities and the challenges of working organically with community are phenomenal. The gap between what communities need and what we perceive they need is so large that mental health professionals seem to be the best people who are able to fill that gap. And to understand the fact from their work that it's very important that we are not imposing anything on the community, rather we are growing with the community and addressing the continuously evolving challenge of diversity. So for me, it has been very, very heartening. And as I can understand, these are very challenging times. And for both Supreet and Vinita to have shared their journey with us, it has been very, very heartening. And I could go on and on, but for me, the learning has been immense. And as I said, for me, it was like, all of us are aware that when we read something, we hear it, we read it. But when you see it come alive, for example, the Ramayana is something that a lot of us grew up reading. But when it was telecast, it was a different ballgame altogether. Similarly, for us, those of us who are entered the field of community psychology, listening to both Supreet and Vinita was for me the Ramayana come alive. And I cannot thank the principal enough for egging us on for this initiative, and cannot thank Garima enough for making this absolutely wonderful initiative for things to come alive. Alive in the context of what is happening not only in our country today, but across the world. And thank you, Manisha, for stepping in for this initiative. With that, I would like to close and express heartfelt gratitude to the principal, to Manisha, and last but not the least, to Garima. Whatever I may say is not adequate to actually state what has been given to all of us. So thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Harinder. And before we close off, a big, big thank you to the panelists once again, Supreet and Vinita, and also to our principal ma'am, who's given us this opportunity to connect together. Really, really thankful for this great opportunity. Really thankful. Yeah, thank you.
From us as well, a very thank you to all of you to having us here, and Garima to give us an opportunity to reconnect again with our roots and our university community, which gave us so much that we could come to where we have. So thank you to all of you as well. We really enjoyed it.
I absolutely second, Supreet. And thank you all so much for giving us a chance to come and share with you.
Reliving of my old times, old memories, reconnecting on an entirely different plane, and we've connected for this webinar. it's truly been very, very, enriching for all of us. Thank you, Vinita. Thank you, Supreet. It's been great having you. It's a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.